It began with a scream in the dead of night, a guttural, desperate cry that shattered the silence of an otherwise ordinary suburban street. In that fractured moment, when darkness felt thicker than ink and every shadow whispered secrets, a lone mutt with wary, brilliant eyes stirred awake. His name was Rusty, a scruffy, resilient terrier mix whose life until now had been a steady rhythm of scavenging scraps and chasing the fading warmth of human kindness. Yet, on that fateful night, as a sickening stench of decay and fear invaded the air, Rusty's instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. Rusty had always been an unintentional witness to the undercurrents of human life, a silent observer of quiet tragedies and hidden cruelties. But nothing had prepared him for the sinister maze he was about to unravel. Drawn by a blend of primal curiosity and an inexplicable need to protect the innocent, he padded silently along the cracked pavement. The night was unusually cold, and every distant, echoing footstep seemed to carry the weight of a secret too terrible to speak aloud. He trotted down the familiar lane of his modest neighborhood, a place where neat lawns and tidy houses concealed stories that even the brightest daylight could not reveal. Here, behind the well-manicured hedges and friendly smiles of neighbors, lay the dark underbelly of human nature. Rusty's ears, attuned to sounds that most would dismiss as mere background noise, picked up a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from behind a row of parked cars near a derelict, shuttered storefront. Something about the sound resonated with him, a pulse of dread mingled with urgency. In the damp gloom of a half-forgotten alley, Rusty discovered his first clue, a tattered scrap of fabric, stained with a mysterious blend of mud and something darker, something that hinted at cruelty unspeakable. His nose twitched as he sniffed the fabric, an aroma that was at once familiar and repulsive. The instincts embedded deep within him urged caution, yet a fierce protective fire compelled him to press on. Each careful step carried him closer to a world he never knew existed, a clandestine network hidden beneath the veneer of everyday life. The following day, under a sky the color of bruised plums, Rusty found himself meandering through the neighborhood park. The park, with its cheerful chirps of birds and laughter of playing children, was a deceptive stage for the sinister drama that had begun the night before. As he trotted along the winding paths, every sniff and every rustle of leaves told a tale, a whisper of a child's terrified cry echoing from distant corners, a murmur of suppressed anguish beneath the jovial chatter. His sensitive ears caught not only the joyful sounds of life, but also a subtle, rhythmic clinking that seemed entirely out of place amidst the normalcy. It was in the shadow of an old oak tree that Rusty encountered a small girl, sitting alone on a weathered bench. Her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and sorrow, met his with a silent plea for help. There was an unmistakable vulnerability in her gaze, as if she carried a burden far too heavy for someone so young. Rusty, instinctively understanding her pain, settled by her feet, his warm presence a quiet promise of protection. In that moment, their fates intertwined, a fragile, unsaid pact formed between an innocent child and a battered, streetwise dog. Over the next few days, Rusty became a silent guardian of the park. He observed the subtle signs, furtive glances exchanged between strangers, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when his ears pricked up, and the uncanny absence of familiar faces. Behind the routine of daily life, a web of terror was being spun, a network of depravity that reached far deeper than anyone dared imagine. Rusty's heart, though only canine, beat with a mix of determination and dread. Every night he patrolled the darkened streets, every day he lingered near the park, trying desperately to make sense of the fragments of horror that had seeped into his world. One crisp morning, as pale sunlight battled the lingering mist, Rusty's journey led him to a seemingly abandoned building at the edge of town. Its crumbling facade and broken windows painted a picture of long-forgotten neglect, yet a faint light flickered behind a dusty curtain of despair. The building was one of only a handful of locations that marked the boundaries of this hidden realm, a place where the normalcy of everyday life was a mask for the unspeakable acts hidden within. With cautious steps, Rusty approached the entrance, his body tense, every sense on high alert. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, as though protesting the intrusion of truth into its murky depths. Inside, the building revealed itself to be a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small, desolate rooms. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something far more disturbing, a lingering trace of anguish and torment that clung to the walls like a malignant shadow. Rusty's eyes darted about, and his ears strained to catch any sound that might indicate movement. He found traces of human presence, discarded personal items, a child's toy forgotten in haste, and even faint, trembling marks on the worn floor that seemed to tell the story of desperate struggles. Here, in this forsaken place, lay evidence of a network far larger and more terrifying than anyone in the neighborhood could have ever suspected. With each step deeper into the building, Rusty's inner turmoil grew. The corridors seemed to stretch on interminably, the silence punctuated only by the occasional drip of water and the echo of his own soft panting. The oppressive atmosphere was a stark contrast to the sunny innocence of the park just a few blocks away. In this place, every shadow whispered of hidden horrors, every creaking board lamented a secret too terrible to keep. The building itself seemed to pulsate with the rhythm of unspeakable crimes, its decaying structure a monument to the abuse inflicted upon those who were too vulnerable to speak out. In a narrow, dimly lit room near the back of the building, Rusty discovered a scene that would forever haunt his memory. There, pinned against a crumbling wall, were photographs, images of children with eyes wide open in terror, captured in moments of vulnerability, and alongside them, images of suffering animals, their expressions etched with pain and resignation. The raw, unfiltered cruelty of those moments leaped from the faded images like specters from a nightmare. Rusty's instincts roared with a protective fury, a silent vow forming within him that he would not allow these horrors to continue unchecked. The dog's heart pounded with an intensity that belied his modest frame, and in that moment, the gravity of the situation crystallized. He had unwittingly stumbled upon a hidden web of depravity, a network that preyed on the most innocent among them. As days turned into weeks, the evidence accumulated like a sinister mosaic, each piece revealing a part of a grotesque puzzle. Rusty's nightly patrols grew bolder, his senses more finely tuned to the subtle signals of danger. He began to notice a pattern, the same men, lurking in the periphery, their faces hardened by the weight of their secret crimes, moving like shadows between the mundane and the macabre. They frequented the quiet streets of the neighborhood, their presence masked by the ordinary flow of life, and yet their eyes betrayed a cruel intent. In quiet moments, Rusty would catch the unmistakable sound of muffled cries, the echo of stifled sobs, resonating from places where light dared not reach. Despite his limitations as a dog, Rusty had an uncanny ability to piece together the fragments of this dark underworld. Every torn piece of cloth, every abandoned toy, and every unsettling murmur in the dead of night contributed to a narrative of horror that was as real as it was unthinkable. The juxtaposition of the neighborhood's benign facade with the reality of the atrocities uncovered was jarring, a living, breathing reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary of masks. One chilly evening, while the town's residents went about their daily routines unaware of the sinister drama unfolding on their doorsteps, Rusty found himself at a crossroads. His pause led him back to the park, where the small girl he had befriended waited, her eyes still reflecting a haunting mixture of fear and longing. As she clutched a threadbare doll to her chest, she murmured softly about nightmares that visited her in the quiet hours, about shadows that whispered her name. The sincerity in her voice, laced with a terror that was impossible to ignore, ignited in Rusty an unyielding resolve. He would not abandon her to the encroaching darkness. He would become the silent sentinel who would bear witness and, in his own way, fight back. The days that followed were marked by an escalating tension, a mounting pressure that rippled through the neighborhood like an undercurrent of dread. Rusty, ever the vigilant guardian, roamed the streets with a newfound purpose. Each night, as he patrolled the familiar sidewalks and alleyways, his senses seemed to absorb every detail, the hurried steps of strangers, the glances that lingered too long, and the occasional glimpse of a man who vanished as quickly as he appeared. The network of abduction and cruelty was not a single isolated event, but a sprawling, insidious enterprise, one that threaded its way through the fabric of everyday life. In the early hours of a rain-soaked morning, Rusty's journey led him back to the abandoned building, the epicenter of this hidden horror. Under a sky that wept with a relentless sorrow, he navigated the maze of corridors with a cautious determination. The building, now more menacing in the pallid light of dawn, seemed to breathe a silent warning into the damp air. As Rusty trotted along a narrow passage, he found himself drawn to a heavy wooden door, its surface marred by scratches and faded warnings in a language that time had almost forgotten. Beyond that door, he sensed the culmination of years of cruelty, a place where the suffering of those unprotected had been kept secret under lock and key. Pushing forward with an instinctive mix of fear and fierce loyalty, Rusty nudged the door open with a tentative snout. The room beyond was cloaked in oppressive darkness, but the dim light that filtered through a grimy window revealed a chilling tableau. In one corner, a battered cot lay abandoned, its thin blanket stained with the remnants of despair. Against the opposite wall, a series of crude marks and symbols were scrawled in a spattering of red, each line a silent testament to torment. In that suffocating space, the echoes of pain and suffering seemed almost palpable, a heavy, tangible presence that pressed against Rusty's fur with every trembling breath. In that instant, the fragile boundary between the known and the unknown shattered. The horrors Rusty had uncovered were no longer distant, abstract nightmares. They were a visceral reality, a bleeding wound in the heart of a community that prided itself on normalcy. The dog's entire being vibrated with a sense of urgency, as if every nerve was alight with the call to action. He felt a fierce, protective anger that surged through him like wildfire, a determination to expose the evil festering in the shadows and to save those who had been left voiceless. As the rain intensified outside, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile glass, Rusty lingered in that room long enough to imprint every detail into his memory. The images of suffering, the acrid smell of fear and decay, and the silent screams of the past were seared into his consciousness. Even as the first hints of dawn began to chase away the night, Rusty's journey had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a stray dog scavenging for survival. He had become a reluctant detective, a guardian of innocence caught in a battle against a dark, relentless force. In the shifting light of early morning, when the world was momentarily lulled into a deceptive calm, Rusty retraced his steps out of the forsaken building. The weight of what he had witnessed pressed upon him, yet there was no time to succumb to despair. Out on the quiet streets, the neighborhood was beginning to stir, unaware of the monstrous truths hidden in its midst. But Rusty knew, every scraped knee, every whispered secret, every frightened glance concealed a deeper story, one that demanded to be told. With every step he took along the rain-washed sidewalks, Rusty carried the silent burden of knowledge, the terrible evidence of a hidden network that preyed upon the vulnerable. The gentle hum of daily life was a cruel mask for the atrocities that had seeped into the cracks of society. And as the morning grew brighter, the dog's resolve hardened like freshly poured concrete. He would continue to search, to follow every trail of blood and sorrow, until the full extent of this horrifying conspiracy was laid bare. The battle lines had been drawn in the quiet spaces between ordinary moments, and Rusty, small, determined, and fierce, would not rest until the darkness was forced into the light. In the hazy glow of dawn, as neighbors began their routines and children laughed without knowing the grim undercurrent swirling beneath their feet, Rusty trotted along with a solemn purpose. His journey had only just begun, but the first shockwaves of his discovery had already sent ripples through the very fabric of the community. The secrets he unearthed in that abandoned building were a harbinger of further revelations, a dangerous labyrinth where the innocent were ensnared and the depraved lurked in plain sight. Every heartbeat of the town now echoed with the silent cry for justice, a cry that Rusty, with his ragged fur and unwavering eyes, was destined to answer. And so, beneath the pale morning light and the lingering scent of rain and decay, the vigilant dog pressed on into the unknown, determined to piece together the scattered remnants of a nightmare that would forever alter the lives of those it touched. Rusty's investigation deepened with every passing day, as if the very air of the town had thickened with unspoken dread. The gentle rustle of leaves in the wind now carried ominous whispers, and the usual hum of daily life became a deceptive lull before another storm of cruelty. Each night, the dog padded out into the gloom with renewed determination, his instincts sharpened by the horrors he'd witnessed. He sensed that every street corner, every dim alley, hid secrets that demanded to be unearthed. In the days following his discovery in the abandoned building, Rusty began to notice unsettling patterns that had once been invisible in the fabric of his small world. The neighborhood park, once a sanctuary of innocent laughter and sunlit joy, now felt like a stage for clandestine transactions of misery. The small girl, whose eyes still brimmed with unspeakable sorrow, clung to her doll with trembling hands as she roamed the park under the watchful gaze of wary adults. Her presence was a constant reminder to Rusty of the stakes of this dangerous game, a fragile life held hostage by forces far more sinister than anyone could imagine. One late afternoon, when the skies were a troubled grey and the air tasted faintly of approaching rain, Rusty found himself wandering near the perimeter of an upscale residential area. The manicured gardens and pristine lawns belied the dark undercurrent swirling beneath. Here, behind wrought iron fences and ivy-clad walls, the wealthy and influential carried on their lives oblivious to the corruption creeping ever closer. But Rusty's sensitive nose picked up a scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something metallic, tinged with an undercurrent of fear. It led him to a narrow side street, where he watched a well-dressed man hurry past, his eyes darting nervously as if he too was burdened with a terrible secret. The man's hurried footsteps seemed to echo in Rusty's ears as he continued his silent pursuit. It was then that he stumbled upon a discreet, nondescript door tucked away behind a row of unremarkable townhouses. The door, painted a faded shade of blue, bore no sign of its true nature. Yet, as Rusty approached, a subtle vibration of malice prickled the hairs along his neck. He lingered at the threshold, his eyes reflecting the dim light, as though daring the darkness to reveal its hidden truths. There was an undeniable pull, an invitation to discover yet another piece of the sinister puzzle that haunted the town. Inside the building, the oppressive atmosphere was compounded by the sound of hushed voices and the clatter of restrained objects being moved in hurried silence. Rusty's keen senses absorbed every detail, the lingering aroma of stale smoke, a bitter mixture of industrial cleaning agents, and the faint, acrid tang of fear that seemed to seep from the very walls. In a cramped corridor, he detected a peculiar sound, a stifled cry, muffled by distance yet piercing in its desperation. It was a sound that resonated with the echoes of his earlier discoveries, stirring within him a burning urgency to uncover the truth behind every whispered horror. Navigating the narrow hallways with the cautious grace of one who had learned to fear every creak and shadow, Rusty discovered a small room at the end of the passage. The door was slightly ajar, and a feeble light spilled out into the darkened corridor like a reluctant beacon. Pushing his snout forward, Rusty peered into the room, and what he saw made his heart pound with an intensity that belied his modest frame. There, in the midst of peeling wallpaper and a threadbare carpet, were scattered belongings, a child's favorite stuffed animal, a torn piece of a brightly colored scarf, and a handful of photographs strewn carelessly on a battered table. The images captured expressions of shock and silent terror, details too raw to be mere coincidence. The room felt like a time capsule of misery, a silent testament to lives interrupted by cruelty. Rusty's eyes, accustomed to the silent language of suffering, took in every detail. The scattered items formed a stark mosaic, a collage of innocence lost in a single, unfathomable moment of despair. His instinct screamed that he was treading dangerous ground, yet he couldn't abandon the quest for truth. With a low, steady growl that vibrated through the cold air, he backed away slowly, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd seen. Outside, as the first raindrops began to fall, creating a symphony of soft taps against pavement and leaves, Rusty rejoined the park. The small girl was there, sitting alone on a bench beneath a drooping willow, her eyes reflecting the sorrow of a soul far beyond her years. She gazed blankly at the rain, her expression unreadable, as if she were waiting for something that might never come. Rusty trotted over and sat by her side, offering his quiet presence as both a comfort and a silent promise that she was not alone. In her silence, he heard the muted echoes of a story that had been locked away in shadows for too long. As dusk settled over the town, casting long, eerie shadows across familiar streets, Rusty's journey grew ever more perilous. The network he had uncovered was not confined to a single location or a single type of cruelty, it was an intricate web that wove through the lives of those who dared to live in the light, while its tendrils reached deep into the hidden recesses of society. On one of his nightly patrols, Rusty sensed he was being followed. The sensation was subtle at first, a distant shuffle, the almost imperceptible sound of footsteps matching his own pace. Yet, with every step, the presence grew more insistent, a silent observer lurking in the darkness. In a narrow back alley flanked by overflowing dumpsters and graffiti-scarred walls, Rusty finally encountered the source of his disquiet. A lanky figure, draped in a long, dark coat and wearing a hat pulled low over his eyes, watched him intently from the shadows. The man's face was obscured, but his posture exuded a cold, calculated menace. For a long, tense moment, the two regarded each other in silence, a clash of primal instinct and human malice. Then, as swiftly as he had appeared, the mysterious figure melted into the darkness, leaving Rusty with a lingering sense of foreboding. The encounter was a stark reminder that those behind the abductions and cruelty were aware of his presence, and they would not hesitate to act if their secrets were threatened. Despite the risks, Rusty pressed on, driven by an unwavering commitment to uncover the hidden truth. Over the following nights, he began to notice more signs, the soft murmur of voices in the distance that suddenly ceased when he drew near, the unsettling glint of headlights as unmarked vehicles slowed to a crawl near his favorite haunts, and even the unnatural stillness of a usually bustling street. Each of these clues built upon the last, forming a mosaic of chilling evidence that suggested a deliberate effort to cloak the sinister network in layers of deception. During one particularly bitter night, as wind howled like a wounded animal and the rain hammered the streets in relentless torrents, Rusty found himself drawn to an industrial district on the outskirts of town. This area, with its abandoned warehouses and rusting machinery, had long been a haven for the forgotten and the desperate. Under the cover of stormy gloom, Rusty slipped into an old warehouse, its cavernous interior echoing with the ghostly sound of dripping water. The building was a labyrinth of forgotten spaces, a maze where shadows danced ominously on the walls, and every step seemed to awaken echoes of past horrors. Inside, amidst the remnants of industrial decay, Rusty discovered a series of makeshift rooms carved out of the larger space. Each room bore the marks of hurried occupation, a threadbare blanket strewn over a cot, personal items hastily abandoned, and scribbled notes on scraps of paper that hinted at names, times, and cryptic codes. One room in particular caught his attention, a small space where a faint light glowed from a single, dirty window. The sight of a child's drawing taped to the wall, a crude depiction of a house surrounded by menacing figures, sent a shiver down Rusty's spine. It was a silent cry for help, a message from someone who had experienced unimaginable fear. The significance of these markings gnawed at Rusty's canine mind. Every detail, from the hurried scrawl of a note to the position of a discarded toy, wove a tapestry of human suffering and cold indifference. He could not fully comprehend the scope of the network that orchestrated such cruelty, but he sensed its vastness, a dark organization that transcended simple crime and delved into the realm of pure malevolence. In the oppressive silence of the warehouse, with the wind rattling the broken panes like a chorus of the damned, Rusty vowed to continue his quest, regardless of the danger that lay ahead. Back in the quieter parts of town, life continued its deceptive rhythm. Neighbors chatted over garden fences, children played without a hint of the lurking nightmare, and life appeared blissfully ordinary to those who chose to remain oblivious. But for Rusty, every corner of that idyllic scene now teemed with hidden menace. Even in the midst of a sunlit afternoon, when the world seemed bathed in the golden glow of hope, he could sense the undercurrent of despair that pulsed beneath the surface, a reminder that darkness had found its way into the hearts of those tasked with protecting the vulnerable. In these moments of stark contrast, Rusty's thoughts would drift to the small girl in the park. Her quiet resilience, her haunted eyes, and the muted tremors of her whispered stories served as both a beacon and a burden. She embodied the innocent victims of a sprawling horror that spared no one. Her silence was the echo of every stolen childhood, every unspoken terror that had seeped into the community like a slow poison. As the days bled into one another, Rusty became a shadow flitting between realms of light and dark. He roamed the streets with a tireless determination, each night unveiling new layers of the network's grim tapestry. He passed by shuttered storefronts and deserted homes, sometimes catching a fleeting glimpse of a clandestine meeting, a whispered conversation between individuals whose eyes shone with a mixture of greed and fear. In these fleeting encounters, the harsh reality of the abductions and cruelty was distilled into the stark truth that evil was not confined to a single place but had woven itself into the very fabric of everyday existence. With each new discovery, Rusty's resolve grew stronger, even as the dangers multiplied. He began to understand that his quest was no longer just about following a trail of clues, it was a silent rebellion against the forces that sought to shroud the town in despair. Even as the world around him seemed determined to ignore the suffering of its most vulnerable, Rusty emerged as a solitary beacon of defiance, a humble guardian with a heart ablaze with fierce loyalty and unyielding courage. Under the dim glow of streetlights and the relentless drizzle that blurred the boundaries between night and day, the dog's journey pressed on. Every alleyway held the promise of a new revelation, every distant sound the hint of another secret waiting to be unraveled. And though he had no allies in this lonely crusade, Rusty's keen senses and unspoken bond with those who suffered made him a silent force against the tide of darkness. As the rain finally tapered off into a weak drizzle and the first hints of dawn began to illuminate the battered streets, Rusty paused atop a small hill overlooking the heart of the town. The panoramic view revealed a stark dichotomy. On one side, the comforting glow of familiar neighborhoods where life moved in its steady, predictable cadence. On the other, the looming shadows of abandoned buildings and hidden spaces that whispered of unspeakable horror. It was here, on that precipice between the known and the unknown, that Rusty felt the weight of his responsibility most acutely. In that quiet moment before the world fully awoke, Rusty's mind was awash with the silent testimonies of the innocents whose voices had been stifled. The rustle of a discarded scarf, the faded imprint of a child's drawing, the spectral outline of a figure disappearing into the night, each fragment was a call to action, a reminder that the true measure of a community was found in its willingness to confront its darkest secrets. With a final, determined glance at the town below, Rusty turned back toward the maze of streets and alleys that held both danger and hope. The journey ahead promised to be fraught with peril, but for Rusty, the path was clear. He would follow the trail of sorrow and secrecy, no matter where it led. Every step was a small act of defiance against a world that had chosen silence over truth. And as the morning light began to assert itself over the battered skyline, Rusty trotted onward, his silhouette merging with the long shadows of a town forever changed by the discovery of its hidden, malevolent underbelly. In that dawning light, the battle lines were unmistakably drawn. The forces of cruelty had woven themselves into every crevice of society, but so too had the resilience of those who dared to resist. And as Rusty continued his silent march through the awakening streets, the quiet determination in his eyes spoke volumes, a promise that he would carry the stories of the silenced and the suffering until every secret was laid bare, and every lost cry was finally heard. Rusty's journey took a darker turn as the days bled into night saturated with a disquieting sense of inevitability. The once familiar streets of the town now seemed transformed, a labyrinth of secret pathways leading to places where unspeakable acts had been committed. Under a slate-gray sky that threatened to weep at any moment, Rusty made his way to the fringe of the industrial district, where crumbling brick walls and rusted metal structures whispered forgotten histories. Every creaking board and distant hum of machinery carried a resonance of anguish that stirred his resolve even further. The industrial park, once a bustling hub of commerce and progress, now lay in eerie silence, the lifeblood of the town drained from its abandoned corridors. Amidst the skeletal remains of factories and storage units, Rusty discovered evidence that confirmed his deepest suspicions, a hidden network that had been operating far longer than anyone had ever imagined. A single, discarded notebook, its pages yellowed and edges frayed, caught his attention. It lay beneath a shattered window, as if forgotten by time. With his snout pressed to the fragile paper, Rusty could almost sense the hurried scribbles of names, dates, and cryptic annotations that hinted at collusion between powerful figures and unseen predators. Following the trail of clues, the dog ventured deeper into the labyrinthine complex. Each step brought him face to face with relics of misery, a child's backpack left in haste, a pair of tiny shoes half buried in a pile of broken glass, and scraps of fabric that bore the unmistakable stains of both neglect and malice. The decaying walls of the buildings, layered with grime and graffiti, served as silent witnesses to the transgressions that had unfolded within their confines. Rusty's heart pounded in time with his cautious steps, his ears alert to every echo of movement in the vast emptiness. In a narrow corridor within one of the larger warehouses, a soft, irregular sound caught his attention, a low, stifled murmur that blended with the ambient creaks of the old structure. Slipping into the shadows, Rusty followed the sound until he reached a partially open door. Beyond it lay a cramped room illuminated only by the weak light of a flickering fluorescent bulb. Inside, the scattered remnants of personal effects painted a picture of hurried abandonment and clandestine meetings. A child's drawing, its colors faded but its message unmistakably desperate, clung to a wall next to a rusted metal chair. The silence of the room was as heavy as lead, broken only by the faint drip of water and the soft rustling of paper in the stagnant air. The fragments of evidence that Rusty gathered were not random, they formed a coherent, though horrifying, mosaic of exploitation and neglect. As he moved from room to room, the dog began to piece together the connections between the disparate clues. The names scribbled on the notebook were tied to addresses he had passed by countless times, tucked away behind the veneer of everyday normality. Some of these locations were familiar: a nondescript house in a quiet cul-de-sac, a run-down community center where children once played freely, now steeped in sorrowful memories. Each new discovery was a harsh reminder that beneath the surface of a seemingly safe community, a malignant force had taken root. Night after night, Rusty retraced his steps along the hidden trails of this network. His paws carried him with a sense of grim purpose, each imprint on the cold concrete an indelible mark of his commitment. He soon became a creature of dual existence: by day, a stray wandering through sunlit streets where laughter and light deceived the unaware; by night, a silent sentinel scouring the darkness for the echoes of lost innocence. In the waning hours before dawn, Rusty would find moments of solitude atop a low wall or behind a discarded dumpster, his eyes reflecting the harsh reality of a world he was determined to save. During one particularly restless night, as an autumn wind howled through the broken panes of an abandoned building, Rusty sensed a change, a subtle shift in the air, a palpable tension that vibrated through the ground beneath his paws. Drawn inexplicably to the source, he navigated a maze of narrow alleys and forgotten side streets until he reached a secluded courtyard bordered by dilapidated structures. The courtyard, overgrown with wild ivy and strewn with litter, seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for a verdict. There, in the midst of the crumbling architecture, lay a small, battered wooden box. Its surface was etched with indecipherable symbols, and it exuded a faint, musty odor that mingled with a trace of something far more sinister. Compelled by a mix of dread and determination, Rusty pawed at the box until it slowly creaked open. Inside, he discovered a trove of items that deepened the mystery and darkened the shadows of his investigation. Among the contents were several folded pieces of paper, yellowed with age, and a small, ornate key that glinted dully in the faint light. The documents, though fragile and worn, contained details of scheduled meetings, coded messages, and references to locations that Rusty had already sensed were part of the network. The key, a relic of a bygone era, seemed to hold the promise of unlocking further secrets that could expose the full extent of the horror that had infected his community. As Rusty absorbed the gravity of his findings, the distant sounds of human activity began to filter through the night. The soft murmur of voices, now tinged with urgency, indicated that someone, or perhaps several people, were converging on the very spot where he had unearthed the evidence. The dog's body tensed, every muscle alert to the threat of discovery. He instinctively knew that the fragile balance of his investigation could be shattered at any moment. With a final, lingering glance at the box, he retreated into the safety of the surrounding shadows, his mind swirling with the implications of the key and the coded messages it was meant to unlock. The following morning, a pallid sunrise crept over the town, its weak light failing to dispel the heavy gloom that had settled over the industrial district. Rusty, though weary from his nocturnal expedition, moved with renewed urgency. His internal map of the town had expanded dramatically. He now knew of hidden entrances, secret rooms, and coded pathways that stitched together the various nodes of the dark network. As he trotted through deserted streets and abandoned lots, every scent, every sound, every fragment of memory from the previous nights coalesced into a clearer, more terrifying picture. In one such instance, while navigating a narrow side street behind a row of shuttered shops, Rusty caught a faint whimpering that seemed to drift from behind a stack of old, weathered crates. Instinctively, he edged closer, his nose twitching as he tried to discern the source. There, hidden away from prying eyes, was a small, frightened child huddled in the corner. The child's eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, locked onto Rusty's as if seeking a lifeline. The tender vulnerability in their gaze sent a jolt of both sorrow and fierce protectiveness through the dog's entire being. Without a moment's hesitation, Rusty sat by the child, his presence a silent promise of safety. For a long time, they remained there in the cool shadows, the child's soft sniffles and Rusty's quiet, steady breaths blending into a poignant symphony of mutual understanding and unspoken grief. The encounter was a stark reminder that every clue, every scrap of evidence, was connected not only to an intricate criminal network but also to the raw, unfiltered human cost of its machinations. The child's presence was a beacon of hope amid the pervasive darkness, a signal that there were still souls in need of rescue and a community desperate for justice. In that moment, Rusty vowed to follow every lead, to risk every shadow and every unknown alley, until the full extent of the network's depravity was exposed and those responsible were forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty. Emboldened by the child's silent plea and the mounting evidence of widespread exploitation, Rusty began to connect the disparate threads of his investigation. The coded messages in the yellowed papers hinted at secret rendezvous in forgotten parts of the town, places where the powerful and the corrupt gathered under the guise of ordinary activity. One such location was an old community hall, long abandoned yet still echoing with the memories of laughter and togetherness. Now, however, it had been transformed into a shadowy meeting place, its ornate facade a cruel irony to the sinister plots it concealed. Under the cover of twilight, Rusty made his way toward the derelict hall, his paws silent against the cold pavement. The building loomed before him like a mausoleum of lost hope, its grand archways and crumbling columns bearing witness to a past that had once been filled with promise. As he approached the heavy, creaking doors, the dog's senses were assaulted by a medley of scents, damp decay, stale smoke, and the unmistakable tang of fear. Every instinct urged him to be cautious, yet his determination propelled him forward. Inside, the hall was a cavern of shadow and memory. The once vibrant murals that had decorated the walls were now faded and peeling, the remnants of a more hopeful time now overrun by the stains of neglect. Rusty's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he noticed signs of recent activity, hastily discarded objects, half-burnt candles, and markings on the floor that had been crudely etched in what appeared to be an attempt to encode information. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as though the building itself were holding its breath in anticipation of some dark ritual. As he ventured further into the hall, Rusty's ears picked up murmurs of voices echoing from a back room. With cautious steps, he made his way toward the source of the sound. There, in a modestly lit room lined with folding chairs and a battered podium, a small group of individuals huddled together. Their faces were obscured by shadows and heavy expressions, their whispers laced with urgency and the weight of secret sins. In that fleeting moment, Rusty could sense the collision of innocence and corruption, the palpable tension of lives entwined in a dangerous dance that defied the everyday normalcy of the town. Every detail in that room was a testament to a truth too horrifying to ignore. The whispered fragments of conversation spoke of hidden compartments, secret keys, and carefully guarded codes, elements that, when pieced together, formed a damning indictment of the network's far-reaching influence. The realization struck Rusty with the force of a gale. The conspiracy was not a series of isolated events, but a deliberate, orchestrated system that preyed on the most vulnerable. The gravity of that understanding spurred him on with renewed vigor, as he retreated from the hall with the echoes of hushed voices and the weight of newfound knowledge resonating in his heart. Outside, the night had deepened into an impenetrable darkness, the kind that swallowed whole any remnants of hope. Yet Rusty's inner light burned brighter than ever, a relentless spark of defiance against the pervasive gloom. The journey had taken him to the very edges of his world, forcing him to confront not only the tangible evidence of cruelty but also the intangible specters of loss and regret. With each step, he grew more aware of the delicate interplay between the mundane and the macabre, between the gentle pulse of everyday life and the sudden, jarring bursts of terror that shattered the illusion of safety. Under the indifferent gaze of a starless sky, Rusty pressed onward, guided by the silent vows of the innocent whose lives depended on the truth being revealed. Every scent, every sound, every whisper of wind carried the collective cry for justice, a cry that the determined terrier was resolved to answer. With the ornate key clutched tightly in his memory and the fragments of coded messages etched into his mind, he navigated the narrow byways and hidden passages of the town, each step a defiant act against the encroaching darkness. In that relentless pursuit of justice, the lines between hope and despair blurred, forging in Rusty an unyielding spirit that transcended the limitations of flesh and bone. His eyes, once merely curious, now burned with the fierce intensity of one who had witnessed too much suffering to turn away. As the city slept unaware of the battles waged in its shadows, Rusty's quiet crusade continued, each silent footfall a promise to the lost, each determined glance a challenge to the forces that had dared to shroud the truth in darkness. And so, in the depth of night and the fragile light of dawn, the stray dog pressed on. With every hidden clue uncovered and every whispered secret chased through abandoned halls and forgotten courtyards, Rusty inched closer to the heart of a conspiracy that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of his community. His journey, filled with raw emotions and shattering contrasts, was not just a quest for evidence, it was a call to awaken a society lulled into complacency, to demand that the voices of the suffering be heard over the din of everyday normalcy. In the cold, unyielding darkness, Rusty's determination shone like a beacon, a testament to the resilience of the innocent and the unwavering power of a single heart committed to fighting back against overwhelming evil. Under the oppressive veil of another moonless night, the relentless quest carried Rusty to a desolate corner of the city where the streets narrowed into a labyrinth of forgotten back alleys. Here, even the distant hum of traffic was stifled by walls so close they seemed intent on concealing every trace of light. With cautious determination, Rusty pressed forward, his paws silent against cold concrete. The familiar pulse of his mission, unraveling a network of cruelty and abduction, propelled him deeper into this shadowed domain. A narrow passage opened before him, its entrance marked by peeling, graffiti-stained brick and an unsettling quiet that hinted at secrets long suppressed. It was as if the very air around the passage exhaled a burden of guilt and whispered warnings to any who dared trespass. Driven by instinct and a fierce loyalty to the innocent voices that had reached him in fragments of sorrow, Rusty entered. The scent of damp decay mingled with a faint trace of something acrid, a chemical tang that evoked memories of sterile hospital corridors and broken promises. Every step echoed like a heartbeat in the silence, a metronome counting down to an inevitable confrontation. As he navigated the cramped corridor, a flicker of movement caught his eye near a rusted door half concealed by shadows. The door's surface was scarred with scratches and cryptic symbols, as though it had absorbed decades of despair. Rusty's ears twitched. Somewhere beyond that threshold, the faint sound of muffled voices reached him, a whisper of human distress that cut through the darkness like a plea. With his body coiled in anticipation, he nudged the door open with a tentative push of his snout. Inside, the room was lit by a solitary, sputtering bulb hanging from a frayed wire. Its light cast erratic patterns across walls marred by water stains and faded murals depicting happier times. On a battered wooden table lay a spread of documents and photographs, each piece of evidence meticulously hidden among everyday clutter. A half-burned candle still clung to life on the table, its trembling flame a fragile defiance against the surrounding gloom. Rusty's keen eyes took in every detail, the scattered images of children whose eyes betrayed a terror too profound for their age, and the grim notes scribbled hastily in a ledger that chronicled meetings and coded addresses. In the midst of the chaos, a new presence stirred. A low, hesitant murmur came from behind a stack of old newspapers. Rusty's heart hammered in his chest as he approached, every sense alert to danger. There, crouched in the fragile sliver of light, was a young man whose face bore the marks of sleepless nights and overwhelming grief. His clothes were threadbare, his eyes clouded with despair yet flickering with a spark of resistance. In that silent exchange, a wordless understanding passed between the man and the dog, a mutual recognition of a shared enemy, of a secret that demanded to be uncovered. The man's voice was barely more than a whisper as he spoke, his words trembling with urgency. "I've been trying to escape, but they always find me." His confession was punctuated by the rustle of papers and the distant, ominous hum of footsteps outside. The atmosphere was electric with the tension of suppressed fear and the desperate hope of liberation. Rusty, though bound by the limitations of his canine form, seemed to radiate a protective warmth, a silent guardian promising that no more would be lost in the void of unchecked cruelty. Their eyes met, and in that frail moment of connection, the man divulged fragments of his ordeal. He had once been part of the organization, forced into complicity, trapped by threats and the iron grip of those who exploited the powerless. He described covert meetings in abandoned warehouses, where influential figures traded secrets like currency, and where vulnerable children were reduced to mere pawns in a cruel game. His voice wavered as he recounted the horrors, a litany of betrayals, the relentless torment of living under constant surveillance, and the paralyzing dread that one's silence could be easily mistaken for complicity. The man's revelations transformed the room into a microcosm of the network's insidious reach. Every document, every faded photograph now bore the weight of a truth too heavy for any soul to bear. Rusty listened intently, his eyes never leaving the man's anguished gaze. Even as the shadows lengthened and the room threatened to engulf them in darkness, there was a fragile glimmer of hope, a spark that perhaps, with enough evidence, the monstrous system could be dismantled. Outside, the world continued its indifferent rotation. The distant sounds of the city, sirens wailing, the soft murmur of late-night traffic, formed a stark contrast to the intense isolation within that room. The man, whose name he would later share in whispered confidences as Mark, explained that he had gathered pieces of evidence for months, desperate to expose the network from within. Yet every step toward justice had been met with threats, and every whisper of truth was smothered by those determined to keep their secrets intact. As Mark spoke, a heavy silence settled between them, filled only by the soft, persistent drip of water from a leaky pipe. The documentation on the table painted a horrifying panorama, a vast, interconnected web that stretched from the darkest corners of society to the polished facades of power. Each entry was a testament to the cruelty inflicted on both children and animals alike, a systematic exploitation orchestrated with chilling precision. Mark's voice grew steadier as he revealed a plan, a final, dangerous maneuver intended to gather undeniable evidence from the heart of the network's operations. He spoke of an upcoming secret meeting in an old factory on the outskirts of town, a gathering that would convene the key figures behind the abductions and cruelty. It was a chance, a dangerous, fleeting opportunity to capture their activities in irrefutable detail. But the stakes were immense. Any misstep could spell doom not only for him, but for everyone caught in the network's relentless grip. The determination in Mark's eyes resonated deeply with Rusty's unwavering spirit. In that moment, an unspoken alliance was forged. The man, a reluctant insider fueled by a desperate desire for redemption, and the dog, whose every instinct demanded the protection of the innocent, became united by a shared mission. They would venture into the heart of darkness together, risking everything to shine a light on the hidden horrors that had corrupted their community. Leaving the safety of the cramped room, Mark led Rusty through a series of narrow passageways and abandoned corridors, each step measured and filled with cautious hope. The journey through these forgotten pathways was a descent into a world that time had tried to erase, a world where the remnants of human suffering lay scattered like broken dreams. Their route took them past graffiti-covered walls that whispered the names of those long silenced, past crumbling staircases that groaned under the weight of history, and past shattered windows that offered fleeting glimpses of a city too preoccupied with its own distractions to notice the darkness festering in its underbelly. Outside, the city's nocturnal pulse was a murmur of secrets and warnings. Every rustle of wind and every distant car alarm punctuated the urgency of their mission. Mark's eyes flickered with both trepidation and determination as he recounted his plan. They would infiltrate the factory during the meeting, record the proceedings, and secure incontrovertible proof of the atrocities. The factory, once a bustling hub of production, now stood as a decaying monument to forgotten industry, a perfect stage for clandestine operations and a haven for those who operated in the shadows. Navigating the labyrinthine alleys with the stealth of a seasoned operative, Mark led Rusty toward the outskirts where the factory loomed, its silhouette a jagged scar against a starless sky. The closer they drew, the more palpable the sense of impending danger became. The air grew colder, each breath a visible reminder of the stakes at hand. Rusty's instincts heightened, his ears straining for the faintest sound, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. At the factory's rusted entrance, the duo paused. The building's facade, marred by years of neglect and vandalism, bore silent witness to the crimes committed within. A single, broken window provided a tenuous view of the dim interior, where shapes moved with deliberate purpose. Mark crouched low, whispering urgent instructions as he produced a small recording device, an essential tool in his plan to capture the damning evidence. Rusty, ever vigilant, remained close by, his body a silent barrier against the darkness. In that charged moment, as the night seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, Mark and Rusty exchanged one last look, a final affirmation of their shared resolve. Then, with a deep, steadying breath, they slipped through the factory door into a world of illicit whispers and hidden horrors. Every step within the cavernous space was measured, every shadow a potential threat. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a palpable reminder that at any moment, the delicate balance between survival and exposure could be shattered by the slightest misstep. Within the factory's cavernous interior, the faint murmur of voices grew louder, accompanied by the occasional clink of metal and the rustle of paper. The meeting was already underway in a large, dimly lit chamber. Figures gathered around a long, scarred table, faces obscured by shadows, expressions masked by feigned indifference. It was a congregation of the damned, orchestrated with the cold efficiency of a well-rehearsed plan. Mark found a concealed vantage point near the back of the room, where he could record every word, every sinister detail. Rusty, sensing the gravity of the moment, settled into a low crouch near the doorway. His sharp eyes flicked across the scene, the deliberate movements, the coded gestures, the occasional glance exchanged between conspirators that spoke of mutual complicity. Every nuance of their behavior was a piece of the puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal the full extent of the network's depravity. The dog's heart pounded in unison with the hushed cadence of the conspirators' voices, each murmur a damning testament to the organized cruelty that had plagued the community. Time seemed to stretch as the meeting unfolded. Mark recorded every confession, every whispered command that left no doubt as to the nature of their crimes. The evidence was mounting, a damning chronicle of exploitation, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. In that oppressive moment, the air was charged with the weight of secrets too monstrous to ignore. The factory, with its dilapidated machinery and stained concrete floors, bore silent witness to the culmination of a long-hidden conspiracy. Just as the conversation reached its most damning crescendo, a discussion of a planned, unspeakable act against a group of defenseless children, a sudden crash echoed through the room. The sound shattered the tense stillness, sending a ripple of alarm through the gathered conspirators. Panic flashed in their eyes, and hurried whispers replaced the measured cadence of their earlier dialogue. Mark's grip on the recording device tightened as he prepared for the worst. In the ensuing chaos, as the conspirators scrambled to regain control, Mark and Rusty melted into the labyrinth of corridors once more. The evidence secured in that fateful night would soon burst into the light, setting off a chain reaction of reckoning that promised to upend the very foundations of the hidden network. Their retreat was a frenetic dance of evasion, a desperate scramble through corridors that seemed to shift with each echoing footstep of pursuit. Behind them, the frantic voices of those who had been so determined to conceal their sins receded into a cacophony of confusion. Out on the cold night air, under a sky that now threatened the first light of dawn, Mark and Rusty paused at the edge of a deserted lot. The adrenaline of the encounter still pulsed in their veins, and the recording device, now heavy with the weight of incontrovertible evidence, rested in Mark's trembling hand. The city around them was oblivious to the battle that had just been waged in its underbelly, yet the seeds of change had been sown with every whispered secret and every captured confession. In that silent interlude, as the horizon softened into the promise of a new day, the resolve in their eyes was unmistakable. Mark's whispered vow mingled with the rustling wind, that every hidden cry for help would be heard, that every dark corner would be illuminated by the light of truth. And at his side, Rusty sat with the steadfast assurance of a guardian who had crossed the threshold of despair to become a beacon of hope, a small, unyielding force committed to unmasking the malevolence that had ensnared so many innocent lives. As the first pale rays of dawn crept over the skyline, washing the world in tentative light, the duo made their way from the factory. Every step they took carried the promise of reckoning, a promise that the cruelty veiled in the shadows would soon be exposed to the unforgiving glare of justice. With hearts resolute and spirits unbroken, they prepared for the next chapter in their dangerous crusade, knowing that the battle against overwhelming darkness was far from over, yet fueled by the hope that even the smallest spark could ignite a revolution of truth. In the pale glow of early morning, as the city stirred in reluctant wakefulness, the secret that had been so painstakingly unearthed began to tremble on the edge of revelation. Mark, his hand still trembling from the adrenaline of their escape, clutched the recording device as if it were a lifeline. The damning confessions, the cryptic documents, and every whispered secret had finally been collected, forming an irrefutable dossier against a network that had long operated in darkness. Rusty, ever the silent guardian, stood at his side with eyes that shone not only with weariness but with an unspoken promise that no more innocent lives would be sacrificed to the cruelty that had so long festered beneath the town's placid surface. They moved through the deserted streets, every step echoing the weight of their mission. In a city that had once been lulled by the comforting rhythms of everyday life, now a storm was gathering, a tempest of outrage and sorrow. Mark's plan was simple yet fraught with peril: to hand over the evidence to those who could dismantle the insidious machinery of exploitation. Yet as they navigated the labyrinthine alleys and empty sidewalks, the dark silhouette of the hidden network loomed large in every shadow, a constant reminder that their actions had already provoked dangerous eyes. At a battered bus stop near the edge of town, Mark paused to catch his breath. The early rays of dawn were breaking through the gloom, scattering the last remnants of night along the pavement. In that moment of fragile calm, he recalled the faces etched in memory, the terrified eyes of children, the resigned glances of abused animals, the haunted expressions of those forced to silence their own pain. Each memory was a plea for justice that spurred him on. Rusty sat by his side, head cocked slightly as if urging him to be steadfast, to carry the burden of truth to the light of day. Mark had arranged a secret meeting with a trusted local journalist, a person whose reputation for tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds had earned them both admiration and fear among those who trafficked in secrets. The journalist's name was Lena, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of truth, unafraid to peel away the layers of corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched. The plan was risky: to arrange a covert handoff of the evidence at a nondescript safe house in the outskirts, where Lena could begin to broadcast the shocking details to a wider audience. The safe house was a modest, time-worn cottage, its paint peeling and windows clouded with dust. Yet within its unassuming walls lay a vibrant defiance, a quiet battleground where truth could flourish. As Mark and Rusty approached, Lena emerged from behind the door, her eyes sharp and her expression steeled with resolve. Without a word, Mark handed her the small recording device and the carefully gathered documents, every piece of evidence a testament to the lives shattered by a network that thrived in the shadows. The meeting was brief and taut with unspoken urgency. Lena's voice, low but fervent, promised that the evidence would not be buried under bureaucratic indifference or the weight of fear. "This will tear down their facade," she murmured, glancing at Mark with a fierce determination. "We'll expose every dark corner, every hidden room where this evil took root." Rusty, ever vigilant, circled silently, his presence a living reminder that the innocent would no longer stand idly by as cruelty reigned unchecked. Days later, as the sun climbed high and the town began to pulse with the rhythms of daily life, the first tremors of change rippled through the community. An unexpected flurry of media activity sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Lena's report, a meticulously detailed chronicle of exploitation and abduction, appeared on every major news outlet. The evidence was irrefutable, a cascade of revelations that connected well-respected community figures, shadowy intermediaries, and clandestine operations that had ensnared the most vulnerable. The broadcast was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. Viewers across the region were gripped by the stark juxtaposition of everyday life with the horrors hidden beneath its surface, a narrative so jarring that it could not be dismissed as a mere anomaly. Law enforcement, propelled by public outrage and the undeniable weight of evidence, mobilized with unprecedented urgency. Raids were conducted in the dead of night, targeting the hidden enclaves where the network had orchestrated its atrocities. One by one, the walls of secrecy began to crumble. Arrests were made, individuals once shielded by layers of complicity and corruption were unmasked, their power and privilege unable to withstand the collective force of a community awakened to its own suffering. The town, long asleep to the cries of its children and the silent suffering of its animals, now found itself at the precipice of profound reckoning. Throughout the chaos, Rusty remained a steadfast presence, a silent, dignified witness to the transformation unfolding around him. His journey had begun as a quest driven purely by instinct, a desire to protect and to understand, and had evolved into something far greater, a beacon of courage in a landscape darkened by human depravity. The small girl in the park, whose sorrowful eyes had once pleaded for solace, was now enveloped in the warmth of community support and professional care. Survivors of the network, long relegated to the shadows, began to emerge with tentative hope, bolstered by the knowledge that their pain was finally being acknowledged. In the weeks that followed, as legal proceedings took shape and community leaders rallied to rebuild the shattered trust, the town underwent a transformation both external and internal. The media frenzy gradually subsided, replaced by a sober, reflective dialogue about the depths of human cruelty and the resilience required to overcome it. Lena continued to report with an unflinching commitment to justice, her stories a tribute to the survivors and a call to vigilance for the future. Mark, though scarred by his past and the weight of his complicity in a system he had been forced into, emerged as a symbol of redemption. He testified in court, his voice steady as he recounted the harrowing details of his entrapment and the relentless pressure to remain silent. His words, raw with the honesty of lived experience, resonated with a community determined to heal. And through it all, Rusty, with his unwavering loyalty and gentle strength, became a quiet legend, a reminder that sometimes the smallest among us can be the most powerful guardians of hope. In a final act that encapsulated the spirit of their struggle, a community memorial was held in the very park where Rusty had first encountered the sorrowful child. Under the shade of a sprawling oak, friends, neighbors, and survivors gathered to honor those whose voices had been stifled by darkness for too long. The ceremony was unadorned and deeply moving, a collection of shared tears, whispered prayers, and silent acknowledgments of loss and resilience. Rusty sat quietly at the forefront, his eyes reflecting the collective sorrow and strength of a community that had been irrevocably changed. There was no grand pronouncement, no theatrical closure, only the simple, enduring truth that the truth had finally been spoken, and that light, however fragile, had begun to push back the darkness. As the memorial drew to a close and the crowd slowly dispersed into a tentative new day, Rusty continued his quiet patrol along the familiar streets. The scars of the past were still visible in the worn pavements and faded graffiti, a permanent reminder of the hidden web that had once ensnared so many. Yet there was also a new narrative emerging, one of accountability, healing, and the unyielding determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. The town had learned that evil could thrive only in silence, and that courage, no matter how small, could ignite a revolution of truth. In the final moments of that day, as dusk painted the sky in hues of hope and remembrance, Rusty paused at the park's edge. The air was cooler now, filled with the soft murmur of recovery and the steady pulse of community resilience. In his eyes, one could see a silent promise that the fight against darkness would never truly end, that every forgotten cry and every stolen moment of innocence would be honored by the relentless pursuit of justice. And so, in the quiet interplay of light and shadow, as the town embraced the long road to recovery, the legacy of one small, unyielding dog endured, a legacy born from a night of terror and nurtured through an unbreakable bond of compassion and courage. Rusty's journey had reshaped a community, exposing the sinister undercurrents that lay beneath a veneer of normalcy and transforming despair into a call for change. His silent vigilance had sparked a movement, proving that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, hope could find its voice, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, would ultimately prevail.